Hello, everybody. This is Fernando for the latest Godzilla on This Day podcast. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about another interesting point in history on this particular day, and it has to do with something that occurred back in Indiana back in 1978. It's an interesting subject because it ties in several things. Number one is the idea of big corporations and the way they evaluate cost analysis, like the way they evaluate lives compared to the costs of fixing things. And then number two, it has to do with a crash involving three teenage girls that kind of spearheaded number three, which is the Ford Pinto, and the way it essentially became infamous for creating dangerous situations with its design. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this particular day. So yes, there was a tragic circumstance that occurred today back in 1978 involving three teenage girls in Indiana. There they were driving down the road whenever they were hit behind by, rear-ended essentially, in a collision by a large van. And when that happened, their car essentially exploded. It burst into flames there on the Indiana highway, and then all three of those girls ended up dying. And so eventually, this was in the heyday of a something that was growing throughout the U.S. It had to do with the Ford Pinto because that was the car that they were driving. The Ford Pinto was a very small, economical car that was Ford's version, or their basically like their ripoff of the Toyota Corolla, the Volkswagen Beetle, and then other smaller imported cars. If you've seen a Ford Pinto on pictures, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a very, very small economic type car. And when it was designed to try to develop something that would, of course, help sales here in the US, and then something help drive or turn around Ford when it came to creating something much smaller than, let's say, their larger Ford trucks or their larger Ford vehicles. So this was introduced back in the early 1970s, but cut to a couple years later, and then lo and behold, rumors started to circulate about there's accidents that were occurring with the Pintos. There's always accidents every single day, of course, in the U.S. People have head-on collisions, rear-end collisions, whatever is the case. However, there was a growing tendency for the Pintos to catch fire. And as this was happening in 1972, sure enough, her car, there was a crash involving her Pinto. It caught fire. She was killed on it, and then her passenger, a guy by the name of Richard Grimshaw, ended up getting burned, unfortunately, over 90% of his body. He survived, but when that happened, he lawyered up, and then he was able to get a case filed against Ford for the way that they created this car. Here's essentially what was the infamy associated with the Pinto. The way it was designed, it was almost as if there was a fatal flaw with its gas tank. Like it was created and placed somewhere near the axle in such a position that whenever it was essentially rear-ended or some kind of accident occurred strong enough on the back of its car, it would cause the gas tank to light itself up, like go on fire. And depending on the level, I guess, of gas within the car, it can be very strong, like essentially like a small, not bomb, but it would essentially just get on fire and then blow up because of the large amount of gas within the tank. And so when that happened, there was evidence that went into this design, like in other words this gas tank and the way it sat within the rear axle. This case brought forth evidence that Ford knew about this fatal flaw, if you could believe it. Whenever they went into designing this particular model, they saw sometime later in the stage, not early enough but later on, they saw that this was going to be a problem. But they went into a cost analysis world. This is where things get really interesting, because there was a memo that was created sometime later on. It was known as the Pinto memo, not the official memo name for it, but essentially that's what it was called. And it was an internal document within Ford, and it stated that they pretty much knew about this flaw, but then they started calculating what would it take to fix the flaw compared to the costs involved of, let's say, fatalities, injuries, and lawsuits occurring later on. It's almost like the most, not sinister, but like the most the unfortunate, almost unethical way of analyzing what's it going to cost us compared to fix it, compared to, let's say, the costs involving giving someone money because of the flaws associated with it. It was crazy stuff. The way I was reading the information, it came down to something along the lines of it would cost Ford like $137 million, something along those lines, to repair all of the cars that were in production already, as opposed to, let's say, the flaws involving of injuries, deaths involving burns, or just other types of damages. That would have been about 49.5 million. So in other words, they would have saved about one third the cost if they just stuck to the production as is with the fatal flaw, instead of, let's say, fixing it. They even went down in this memo comparing the number of projected deaths, the projected of number burns, the projected of number injuries. I mean, this is crazy stuff, to think that there was a corporation, a major corporation, that was actually thinking this, and this was all uncovered because of that lawsuit that was there. And so that guy ended up winning, rightfully so. It was a huge settlement, something like $128 million. I don't know if it was kept that way or if it was lowered down, but this case became a landmark case because it is, to this day, it still remains a popular case in business ethics within any kind of specialized school, business school, of showcasing and comparing companies doing the right thing as opposed to companies doing things just for profit. And it also became a landmark case in tort reform, because tort is, I think, like a fancy way of saying limiting the amount of jury awards, because this one, it was again $128 million. It all ties back to this day involving the Ford Pinto crash in Indiana, because in their case, the girls that were in that car, apparently they did not receive the recall notice, because eventually, finally, Ford decided to voluntarily recall nearly 2 million Pintos out there with this fatal fuel tank design. But the recall did not arrive at the address of the girls' home until 1 year after their crash. So it was something where it goes to show that this could have all been avoided and 3 lives could have been saved, if but for the fact that Ford did not decide later on to just drag things out and then try to save money afterwards. So crazy stuff. I know there's probably still out there stuff to this day. I mean, there was the notion of Volkswagen and the way that they purposely engineered their cars to not emit, to showcase emissions, lower amounts in this case of carbon dioxide in the air, like they were manipulating numbers. And then there was another one involving Toyota, where they had the airbag recall, where they knowingly sent that stuff out. And then the other one, of course, with GM, involving a tiny piece of hardware, very tiny, that was within the steering wheel that would cause the keys to fall off or the system to lock, all just save like just a couple of bucks per car. Crazy stuff. So even though this all happened back in the 70s, this stuff is still happening to this very day. But yes, that is this edition of Godzilla on This Day podcast. So, alright, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.